Welcome back to Sustainability and Stewardship Matters podcast, which focuses on product regulatory and environmental sustainability topics important to the chemical industry. I'm Hannah Bleecker, product steward for Dispersions and podcast co-host.
And I'm Lindsey Foster, product steward for Resins and podcast co-host. This is episode 3, State Legislation on the Rise. Today, we're exploring the vast landscape of U.S. state-level legislation and regulations and discussing how the legislative process impacts the chemical industry. Our guest today is BASF's Director of U.S. State Government Affairs, Mike Heltzer. Welcome, Mike. Would you please tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. First, thank you, Hannah and Lindsey, for inviting me to be a part of this podcast. Interaction with our customers is so important, and I'm really pleased to assist however I can in keeping them updated on what's taking place in the government affairs space, particularly where I work, which is at the state level. As for me, I've been with BASF for 18 years. Before coming to BASF, I worked in government affairs for a trade association that protects brand names and trademarks. And prior to that job, I was a legislative assistant in the New York State Legislature. My entire career has been focused on advocacy, and it's something I've always been excited about. And I'm anxious to share my enthusiasm for the topic.
Great, Mike. We're really excited to hear from you and to have you share your expertise. I think it's critical that we understand and have knowledge of how the state legislative process works so that our Dispersions and Resins group can continue to provide innovative products that meet regulatory requirements. To lay some groundwork, let's talk about legislation versus regulation. Often these terms are used interchangeably, so could you please explain the difference?
Great question. You can't have regulations without first enacting legislation. Legislation passed by a state legislature or Congress and then signed into law by the chief executive, for example, a governor, lays out the intent of the legislative body and provides direction to regulatory agencies and the public. Regulations are how agencies of the executive branch interpret the law and provide specificity on how, for example, a program authorized by the legislature will be administered. BASF's government affairs team is primarily focused on the legislative side of things, although we also work with our legal and business colleagues on implementation matters, which touches on the regulatory space.
Yes, I like to think of legislation as the roadmap, whereas regulations are like the owner's manual.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a really great explanation. So it's been a while since I've taken a history class or had a civics lesson, but I do recall that states are granted the ability to act, and they don't have to wait on the federal government to pass legislation and implement their own regulations. Mike, since you manage state government affairs, can you please explain what gives states this authority?
Sure. While the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land, the Founding Fathers did place limits on the federal government's power. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution provides that any powers not delegated to the federal government by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. That doesn't mean that a federal law cannot preempt a state action. Indeed, it can. For example, if a state or local law conflicts with a federal law, the state or local law must defer to the federal side, unless the federal law is unconstitutional. But the point is, at the end of the day, states retain a lot of authority under our system of law, and business leaders would do well to remember that as they chart a course for their products and services.
Interesting point. Despite their smaller size, states possess significant power and authority that is not necessarily inferior to that of the federal government. Let's talk for a moment about the federal government, actions it has taken, and how this ultimately carries over to what state governments are doing. Congress has been very slow to pass bills. So can we talk a little bit about this and why are states picking up the slack on issues specifically impacting the chemical industry and its customers?
There's gridlock in Congress for sure, Hannah. So far in the 118th Congress, which began on January 3rd, 2023, there have been 64 public laws enacted, compared to the 115th Congress, where 443 bills were enacted when it concluded. Partisanship is indeed at an all-time high in the nation's capital, and there are very narrow majorities in both the U.S. House and Senate, which makes it even more difficult to get things done. In the absence of federal leadership on key issues, including those of importance to the chemical industry and our customers, states have acted. State legislators, which number more than 7,500 in total, are responding to constituent concerns, seeing a void left by Congress, and charting their own courses. Each of those 7,500 plus legislators have their own agendas. In 2024, the American Chemistry Council is tracking close to 600 bills at the state level, not to mention all of the legislation being tracked by state chemical industry councils, chambers of commerce, and manufacturer associations, which impact the business of chemistry and our customers. The Chemistry Council of New Jersey, which I chair, is tracking over 400 bills in that state alone. Thousands have already been proposed.
Wow, that is a lot of bills to track this year in one state alone. Would you say it's easier for states to pass legislation in comparison to the federal government?
I don't know that it's easier for states to pass legislation. The process is certainly more intense, particularly since several state legislative sessions last only 3, 4 months, or 5 months. In some respects, it might even be harder to get a state level bill through because of the shorter sessions. The politics are still very much present, so I think timing is a big factor, but also the fact that state legislators are often closer to their constituents and have more direct interaction with them, that plays a role as well.
I'm hearing there's a lot of bills and a shortened timeline, therefore it isn't really easier to pass legislation at the state level. But what does this ultimately mean for our advocacy efforts? How do our advocacy efforts differ between the federal and state levels, and how does this impact partnerships with legislatures?
They really don't differ all that much, Hannah. At the end of the day, advocacy is advocacy. It's about developing relationships, being honest with the information you provide, and being a resource for legislators and staff. Partnerships and collaboration are critical in this effort. BASF works closely, for example, with its trade associations in advocacy matters. On the state level, that means working with our CICs, or state chemical industry councils, as I referred to a moment ago, the state chambers of commerce, and manufacturing associations.
I couldn't agree more, Mike. Being open and honest is really the best way to build relationships and foster that partnership between industry and the legislators. Now, I'm curious to know, Mike, what kind of information do advocacy groups provide? Can you expand on that a little bit more? Are they promoting harmonized legislation among states? And when might advocacy groups put forth what we call model policies?
Lindsey, BASF works closely with its trade associations and often takes leadership roles within such groups. Like I mentioned a moment ago, I happen to be chair of the New Jersey State Chemical Industry Council. Trade associations play a vital role in communicating industry positions on many issues and act as a forum for member companies to come together to discuss policy development. This includes the creation of model legislation to advocate for in the states. For example, BASF has worked with the American Chemistry Council to advocate for model legislation that promotes advanced, or sometimes called chemical recycling, at the state level.
Lindsey and I were just discussing the significance of monitoring model legislation introduced by industry associations and how they can be a legislative catalyst, as well as other drivers that we need to keep an eye on.
Yes, we were diving into how to best track this type of movement and what type of activity should garner our attention, whether it's consumer concerns, test data, action by other states, or even the media. Mike, I'd love to hear your perspective. Are these the main catalysts for legislation in the states? Are there others? And what is the significance of each?
Lindsey, politics is often a big driver for state legislative action, just like it is for Congress. There's also feedback from constituents. Let's remember what former U.S. House Speaker Tip O'Neill once said: all politics is local. Legislators want to demonstrate to their constituents that they're getting the job done in terms of addressing local needs and concerns. And yes, what other states are doing is also a factor. Once one state acts on an issue, it serves as a model for other states. Legislators in state acts begin asking themselves, if statewide did this, shouldn't we be doing the same? State legislators also attend national conferences, just like we do in the business community, and they actively exchange ideas and experiences. And of course, media reports do play a role as well. Legislators understand that their constituents are reading the same articles, listening to the same news reports. Very often, these reports will spur conversations, letters, and emails to legislators from constituents, and a bill will be introduced.
Great points, Mike. Another topic we monitor regularly is the industry standards and the phase out of replacements per those standards. BASF places a great importance on ensuring that we offer products that not only comply with those standards, but exceed them. So in our role as stewards, Lindsey and I actively track the same sources of information, the media news reports, test data, and even the potential impact of proposed legislation in different states. By monitoring these sources, we're staying informed about upcoming developments and trends that help us tailor our compliance strategy accordingly.
That's so true, Hannah. We've seen where changes to regulations or registration requirements globally can impact the data that's available for specific substances. The new information that comes out has the potential to impact our understanding of entire chemistries and furthermore spur innovation. It's also so important to stay informed on what legislation is being proposed, because even if that legislation isn't enacted, it could still drive product standards and end-use certifications. I think that's where our overlap of advocacy involvement and tracking emerging regulations can be critical to our business and our customers in providing and receiving that regulatory information.
Yeah, incredibly important insights, Lindsey. Given the impact from proposed legislation, Mike, and your position on the front lines to legislative action, what states should we really be on the lookout for in terms of activity affecting the chemical industry?
Hannah, I think the Northeast and Western states have been especially active in recent years when it comes to chemical regulation issues. I continue to watch New York, New Jersey, and the New England states, California, Washington, and Oregon on the West Coast. A lot of the state activity moving forward will also be determined by what takes place in the national election in 2024. If we still have divided government in Washington, D.C. come January 20th, 2025, we can expect the states I just mentioned and others to continue to chart their own courses.
It's good to note that the results of the upcoming election could have an impact on legislative activity. Since the states are currently taking a lot of action while Congress has not really been as productive, I'm curious, Mike, how does this affect our advocacy strategy and our overall business plan?
Lindsey, we have a patchwork of state laws, notably in the chemical regulation space. A half dozen states, for example, may ban a product or otherwise regulate it somehow, whereas the rest of the states do not. The preferred option for business is typically a nationwide approach. Generally speaking, uniformity and regulatory certainty are better for business. The patchwork, on the other hand, creates challenges such as compliance costs. It's also difficult for consumers as well, as they struggle to understand what is legal in a neighboring state, but not their own.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that potential for struggle in a few areas lately. For example, the area of exempt solvents and VOC requirements. There are several regional regulations in California currently under review where they are considering removing a couple solvents that have been exempted for years to attain lower VOC emission levels. These solvents are still on the US EPA's exempt solvent list, so if these measures pass in California, it will create that level of complexity you mentioned for compliance, both for BASF and for our customers. It's a likely scenario that a business impacted by these regulations could have a product on the market that is compliant on a federal level, but not compliant for sales into this specific region of California.
Yeah, so true. Complexity has definitely increased as our organization manages the inconsistent regulations between each of our 50 states and between the state and federal government. The chemical industry is going to continue to need dynamic internal systems to manage any potential impacts this could have on supply chains. In our podcast, we continually talk about our commitment to sustainable products. How can states be a part of the solution and help to progress sustainable product innovation? And what would be the benefit of increasing state regulations, Mike?
Hannah, I think states can help by working with one another and with industry. Let's have a concrete, honest dialogue that's based on the science behind a product or issue. As a graduate school professor of mine once said, it's not the madness or the badness of the individuals, but in the communication. And by the way, I would add, regulation is not necessarily a bad thing. For example, it gives confidence to our customers, consumers, and the general public that our products have met rigorous safety standards and are safe for their intended use. It's the main reason that we support adequate funding for state and federal regulatory agencies.
Thank you for the insight, Mike. We only have time for a few more questions, so we'll begin wrapping up. I'd like to talk about the current state of things and future considerations for this year. Since we have such a high level of state activity, what specific product regulations are you anticipating for the rest of 2024, and what hot topics remain on state agendas?
Extended producer responsibility, or EPR legislation, for single-use packaging, including plastic packaging, has been on states' agendas. EPR is essentially a product stewardship program. So far, 4 states have been packaging EPR laws: Maine, Colorado, Oregon, and California. And actually, since we've been talking about this podcast in March, Minnesota has just passed their EPR bill to join those states this year. So we're now up to 5 states with EPR packaging laws. New York and New Jersey are considering EPR measures as well. Inside and outside the context of EPR, we are also continuing to push for acceptance of advanced, or as I said earlier, chemical recycling of plastics, which is a key part of making the circular economy a success.
Absolutely. EPR has been a very active topic in the past few years, and I've noticed that activity ramping up again this year. This legislation is another really good example of how the intent across the states is the same: to reduce waste, encourage sustainable products, and support a circular economy. But the requirements and implementation can vary widely across the nation.
Well, we're also watching bills that give state agencies the authority to regulate chemicals and products. And going back to plastics for a moment, we're also keeping an eye on microplastics legislation. California in particular, I believe, has a measure it's considering. Rhode Island has a microplastics bill as well. This and more are in addition to state-specific measures that may impact our sites, like energy issues, for example.
Well, speaking of microplastics, we will be discussing this topic in episode 4, so stay tuned, everyone. And now a final question for you, Mike. It's a big year in the U.S. You mentioned it earlier, it's an election year. How will this impact state legislation now?
I think many state legislators will be anxious to finish their sessions and get home as quickly as possible to begin campaigning. It's a presidential election year as well, so the spotlight will be intense right on down the ballot. State legislators will be especially eager to communicate with their constituents about what they did during the most recent legislative session.
This is a great time for a reminder that everyone should get out and vote, right, Mike?
Absolutely, Hannah. Everyone should make time to review candidates and their positions, both at the local, state, and federal levels, get to know what the ballot proposals are, and get to the voting booth. It's our most important civic duty to get out and vote.
Mike, this conversation has been really engaging. It's evident that we all have an appreciation for government affairs topics, and personally, I have thoroughly enjoyed discussing legislation, its impact, and positive effects on the chemical industry. Additionally, gaining your unique perspective on what lies ahead has been really insightful. Although I could talk about this for hours, all good things must eventually come to an end.
Yes, I really value you sharing your perspective and more about your involvement, Mike. I think we all can agree that it's more important now than ever to track the regulatory movements at the state level. The impact of proposed and passed legislation really charts the course for the future of the chemical industry.
Thank you, Hannah and Lindsey, for this great opportunity to connect with our businesses and especially our customers. BASF Government Affairs is happy to work with customers directly when needed.
Thanks, Mike. For our audience, we hope you join us on our next episode of Sustainability and Stewardship Matters, where we will be discussing microplastics, one of the many regulatory topics being discussed at the state level.
For those of you interested in more information on dispersions and resins, we have links available to our BASF website and have provided contact details for our product stewardship team. If you want to listen in to any of our previous Sustainability and Stewardship Matters podcast episodes, you can use the QR code or link to visit our Dispersions and Resins YouTube channel. For more information on government affairs or to ask Mike a question, you can contact him directly at michael.heltzer@basf.com. As always, we appreciate you listening to Sustainability and Stewardship Matters.